Well, Russian security forces have arrested nearly 1,500 supporters of the jailed opposition leader Alexey Navalny. They were among the thousands of protesters who ignored official warnings not to take part in so-called illegal gatherings. Nonetheless, those gatherings were held across Russia, from St. Petersburg to Moscow to Vladivostok in the Far East. Many would-be demonstrators were rounded up and detained during early morning raids, and that meant the overall turnout fell short of the 500,000 mark Navalny's team had hoped for. But still, this was a notable act of defiance. Time to begin as President Vladimir Putin was ending his annual address to the nation. Putin made no mention of Navalny, but did warn other countries not to interfere in Russia's domestic affairs. We have more details now from CNN's Fred Pleitgen reporting in from Moscow.
Scores of people took to the streets here in the Russian capital, Moscow, but also in cities across this vast country to protest what they say is the unfair and inhumane treatment of jailed opposition leader Alexey Navalny. But many of them told us that they were generally also dissatisfied with the way this country is being run by Vladimir Putin.
You know, I feel like Putin is just abusing his power to unacceptable degree. He extended his term longer and longer, and he's just stagnating Russia more and more. He tries to escalate relationship with foreign countries.
Riot police was certainly out in full force as the authorities had warned people before not to take part in what they called unsanctioned protests. And indeed, hundreds of people were detained, although not as many as we've seen at protests in the past. Nevertheless, opposition leader Vladimir Kara-Murza, he told me in an interview he believes that all this shows that the Kremlin is nervous.
The biggest thing Putin is terrified of is the sight of people on the streets. The biggest fear for any dictator are citizens of their own countries. The biggest fear for any dictator are their own people.
The opposition certainly didn't pick this day at random. In fact, this is also the day that Russian President Vladimir Putin held his annual State of the Nation address. And there, he showed himself to be defiant. He warned other countries not to cross red lines as Russia defines them.
Whoever organizes any provocations that threaten our core security will regret this like they've never regretted anything before.
The Russian leader there is certainly very defiant, but the opposition also defiant, and they vow to carry on with their protests until Alexey Navalny gets the treatment by the doctors he wants to see him. Fred Pleitgen, CNN, Moscow.
Jill Doherty is a professor at Georgetown University. She was also CNN's longtime Moscow bureau chief. Before that, White House correspondent, and she is with us this hour from Washington, D.C. Jill, thanks for coming back. Good to see you.
Hey, John. Good to see you.
Okay. Well, Putin, he saved the kind of the threats and the bluster for the end of the speech, as well as this sort of unique worldview he has that, you know, Russia is not the militaristic aggressor here, but rather the victim of a Western plot of containment. And then he added this for good measure.
Russia is poked all the time, without any reason. Of course, instantly around them, you can see all the smaller hyenas, like around a large tiger, just like in the Kipling story.
The Kipling story being the Jungle Book, and he compared the US to the villainous tiger. But before we got to this point of quoting Kipling, Putin spent, a good deal of time outlining plans for a modernized nuclear arsenal, a hypersonic cruise missile, a nuclear torpedo designed to set off a radioactive tsunami, not to mention more than 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border. Playing the victim card seems a hard sell here. So explain, how do these two ideas actually exist side by side in Putin's brain or his thinking here?
You know, that's always very dangerous, and far be it from me to try to psychoanalyze the president. But I do think, watching that speech and watching the body language, and I listened to the whole thing in Russian, and there was a certain cockiness at the end. As you mentioned, the short part that he had international issues. And I think what he thinks is that the West, debauched, depraved as it is, not on the moral level of Russia, is really trying to, as he said, he used that word poke, just nudging Russia. And Russia's very patient, he would argue, but eventually don't play us for fools. He said, we want good relations, but I was really struck by that. Those planning provocations will regret their deeds in a way they have not regretted anything else for a long time. That's pretty strong. So I think he's looking at a lot of problems. He's got, the U.S. sanctions. He has what's going on in Ukraine. He's got Navalny and the people on the streets in Moscow the very day that he's delivering his speech. And I think he's just, showing that he's ready for anything.
And you mentioned the protesters. There were thousands on the streets, not as many as we'd seen a few months ago, but still there were a lot on the streets. They were demanding the release of Alexey Navalny. And that's despite the fact that many of Navalny's supporters were actually rounded up in advance and had been detained. And that's a move which the EU described as deplorable. But still, they managed to create this sort of split screen moment with Putin trying to sound strong and appear strong on one side of the screen, thousands of protesters on the other side of the screen. For any political leader, that is usually a sign of weakness, right? Not strength. And is that true for Putin as well?
Well, I think he's taking a harder and harder line. You have Navalny apparently in very serious physical condition. You have the move right now, the legal move to declare his organization and a couple of other organizations that are allied with it, extremist organizations. And that would be very serious. You could begin to lock up people for a very, very long time. So, I'm sure that he was not pleased that there were all of those people on the streets. But they, in Moscow, they were pretty reserved and did not take the physical action that they did in St. Petersburg. But they can turn it on at any time if they want to.
I want you to listen to the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Wednesday on how the White House now plans to deal with Russia and Putin moving forward. Here he is.
Unlike the previous administration, we will be taking steps to hold Russia accountable. Now, is it going to stop Vladimir Putin from doing everything we don't like? Of course not. But do we believe that we will be able to take a firmer, more effective line when it comes to Russian aggression and Russian bad behavior? Yes, we do. At the same time, I would just like to reiterate that that doesn't rule out being able to work with Russia where it's in our interest to do so. We can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah, this is the fine line here for the Biden administration. They take this tough line on Russia for the cyber warfare stuff, but trying to lower tensions with Moscow as well to prevent this relationship from boiling over. The worst case scenario is that Alexey Navalny should die here, and that massively complicates everything and would be a huge distraction for President Biden.
Yes, and you can bet right now the Biden administration is figuring out what it would do if Navalny does die. So that's a very serious issue. But I think, Putin is kind of doing this walk and chew gum thing too, although the message here was pretty hard. But he is saying, I want arms control, but I have nuclear weapons. So there was a lot of posturing. But I do think that he wants some type of communication with the Biden administration. It's just at this point, I think he feels vulnerable. And so he is trying to show as strong as he can be to go into what may be behind the scenes and even in front of the scenes, some type of meetings, negotiations, and communication with the Biden administration.
So just very quickly, you can see like a pathway here where both the US and Russia can find like a common cause and a common pathway. So there could be some positives out of this, like climate change, for instance, arms control.
Yeah, climate change, speaking of which, President Putin has agreed to take part in the climate summit virtual that President Biden has announced in the next couple of days. And that's a good sign. Arms control, obviously, they agreed on extension of New START. So there are these possibilities, but you still have to look at the tone of what is going on. And beyond those two things, you begin to wonder, what can they, make any progress on? It's not hopeful at all at this point.
Okay. Jill, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate being with us.